In the West, people whispered one name when they wanted a man found, because when this bounty hunter took a job, someone always ended up in chains. But this time, the target was different. The frontier had many hunters. Some chased buffalo, some chased gold, but a few rare men chased other men, and among them, one name carried a reputation colder than the desert night. Silas Crow. Years before bounty posters carried the name Silas Crow across the frontier. He had been just another drifter, riding west with nothing but a tired horse and a borrowed revolver. Back then, nobody knew his name, and nobody cared. The West had a way of swallowing men like that. Rail towns were filled with them young guns trying to prove something, older men trying to forget something, and strangers chasing rumors of land, money, or redemption. Silas was chasing none of those things. He was simply running from a past he never talked about, and from mistakes he never explained. The few people who asked questions usually stopped asking once they saw the quiet warning in his eyes. For months, he drifted between towns, taking small work where he could, guarding supply wagons, breaking horses, helping ranchers move cattle across open plains. But the West had a cruel sense of timing. One winter night in the Arizona Territory, Silas found himself riding through a narrow canyon trail long after the sun had disappeared behind the mountains. That was when the men appeared. 3 of them, outlaws who had been waiting in the dark, watching the trail for anyone unlucky enough to pass through alone. Silas didn't have time to turn back. The first shot shattered the silence of the canyon and sent his horse panicking beneath him. The second bullet tore through his coat and carved fire across his shoulder. Within seconds, he was on the ground, bleeding into the cold dirt. The outlaws approached slowly, laughing under the pale moonlight. To them, Silas was just another traveler, with a horse worth stealing and boots worth selling. He tried to reach for his revolver, but his hand wouldn't move. One of the men raised a rifle, ready to finish the job, and that was when another gunshot fracked through the canyon. The outlaw with the rifle dropped instantly. The other 2 barely had time to react. Before more shots echoed off the stone walls, within moments, the ambush had become something else. Entirely, Silas lay there in the dirt, vision fading, listening to the chaos around him. When it was over, a single pair of boots walked toward him through the dust. The man who knelt beside him wore a weathered coat and carried himself with the calm confidence of someone who had survived far worse nights than this one. His name was Daniel Mercer. Silas would learn that later. That night, Mercer didn't ask questions. He didn't lecture. He simply patched the wound, built a small fire, and stayed awake through the freezing darkness to make sure the stranger beside him didn't bleed to death. For 3 days, Daniel Mercer helped Silas recover. They shared food, stories, and the kind of quiet conversations that only happen between men who understand the harsh rules of the frontier. Mercer was not a lawman, but he wasn't an outlaw either. He was something rarer in the West, a man who still believed that some lives were worth saving. Before they parted ways, Mercer said something Silas never forgot. "In this world," he told him, staring out across the desert horizon, "most men are remembered for the worst thing they've done." He glanced back at Silas. "But sometimes a man gets a chance to be remembered for something better." Then Daniel Mercer rode away. Silas never expected to see him again. Years passed. Silas Crow became the most reliable bounty hunter in the frontier, and, somewhere out there, Daniel Mercer disappeared into the endless dust of the West, until the day Silas walked into that sheriff's office and saw Mercer's face staring back at him from a wanted poster. *Silas, Crow sat in the sheriff's office long after the sun had slipped behind the buildings outside. The wanted poster remained on the desk. Between them, Daniel Mercer. The name alone carried weight now. Not the quiet respect Silas remembered from years ago, but the kind of reputation that traveled through the West like a gathering storm. The sheriff leaned back in his chair, studying Silas carefully. "You know him," the sheriff said. Silas didn't answer immediately. His eyes stayed on the faded ink portrait. The drawing wasn't perfect, but the face was unmistakable. Older now, harder. The lines around the eyes deeper than Silas remembered. But it was still him. Daniel Mercer. Silas finally spoke. "What's he done?" The sheriff sighed and reached for a bottle on the corner of the desk. "Depends on who you ask." He poured himself a drink before continuing. 3 trains robbed in the last 6 months. 2 bank escorts shot dead near Abilene. A stagecoach company swears Mercer and his gang cleaned them out near the border. Silas listened without moving. The sheriff slid another sheet of paper across the desk. Reports, witness statements, rumors written in shaky handwriting. "Folks say he's leading a crew now," the sheriff continued. "Smart men. Organized. They move fast and disappear faster." Silas picked up the paper slowly. Train robberies, shootings, across the dusty towns of the American frontier. Posters with his name attached to successful captures hung in sheriff's offices like quiet trophies. Ranchers spoke of him in low voices around lantern light. Outlaws spoke of him with something closer to fear, because Silas Crow never missed, not once, for nearly 15 years. The bounty hunter had ridden alone through territories where law barely existed. Bandits hid in canyon caves, killers vanished into mining camps, and thieves slipped between railroad towns like ghosts. But if Silas Crow was hired to find you, the chase was already over. He wasn't the fastest draw in the West, not the loudest either. In fact, most people who met him remembered almost nothing about him at all. A tall figure, dust-colored coat, eyes that watched more than they spoke. Silas never bragged, never celebrated. And he rarely fired his revolver unless he absolutely had to. That was another strange thing about him. Despite the reputation that followed his name, Silas Crow preferred bringing men back alive. Bound hands, heavy chains, quiet rides back to whatever town had offered the reward. Some bounty hunters chased blood. Silas chased endings, and every ending brought another reputation. Sheriffs trusted him, judges relied on him, and bounty boards from New Mexico to Kansas slowly began carrying a silent expectation. If the job truly mattered, you hired Silas Crow. One evening, in a small town whose name most maps had already forgotten, Silas stepped into a sheriff's office where a single poster waited on the desk. The reward was the largest he had ever seen. $5,000. For one man. The sheriff slid the poster across the table. Silas looked down at the face, printed in faded ink, and for the first time in 15 years, the bounty hunter who never missed did not immediately say yes, because the man staring back at him from the poster had once saved his life. A gang. None of it sounded like the man he had known in that canyon years ago. Daniel Mercer had saved a stranger's life for no reason other than it was the right thing to do. That wasn't the kind of man who built a gang of killers, but the frontier had a way of changing people. Silas understood that better than most. The sheriff watched him carefully. "You're the only man I know who could find him," he said, "and bring him back alive." The words hung in the air. Bring him back alive. That had always been Silas Crow's reputation, the bounty hunter who didn't kill unless there was no other choice. The man who preferred chains over coffins. But this job felt different. He looked at the reward number, printed at the bottom of the poster. $5,000. Enough money to buy land. Enough to disappear somewhere quiet and leave the hunting behind forever. The sheriff leaned forward. You don't have to decide tonight. Silas finally stood. He folded the wanted poster carefully and slipped it inside his coat. I already did, he said. Outside, the town was quiet. Lanterns glowed along the wooden street. Horses shifted lazily beside hitching posts. Somewhere down the road, piano music drifted from a saloon doorway. Silas walked toward the stable. Where his horse waited, the desert wind moved slowly through the street, carrying dust and distant thunder. By morning, he would be riding west, not chasing a stranger, but hunting the one man in the world he owed his life to. And in the silent hours of that night, Silas Crow understood something that made the job heavier than any bounty he had ever carried. This time, even if he succeeded, there would be no victory waiting at the end of the trail. Silas Crow tracked Daniel Mercer for nearly 2 weeks, across the dry spine of the frontier. Mercer's gang moved. Carefully, they avoided towns, rode through forgotten trails, and left behind almost no trace. But Silas had spent 15 years hunting men who thought they could disappear. No one vanished forever in the West. Not from him. The trail finally led him to a narrow valley, surrounded by rust-colored cliffs. Smoke from a small campfire curled into the evening sky. Silas stopped his horse on the ridge above. Below, 4 horses were tied near a cluster of rocks. 4 men sat around the fire. One of them was Daniel Mercer. Even from a distance, Silas recognized the calm way Mercer carried himself. The years had hardened him, but the posture was the same. Silas waited. The wind shifted, carrying fragments of conversation up the slope. They're moving the prisoners tomorrow, one of the men said. Another spat into the fire. Pinkertons think they can hang half the territory. Mercer's voice answered, low but steady. Then we stop them before they reach the rail line. Silas froze. Prisoners.pinkerton. Signings. This didn't sound like a gang planning robberies. Silas moved closer along the ridge, careful not to make a sound. The conversation below became clearer. They've got 6 men locked in those wagons, another outlaw muttered. Sheriff calls them train robbers. Mercer shook his head slowly. They're farmers, he said. Men who refused to sell their land when the railroad came through. The fire crackled between them. The company calls them criminals, Mercer continued. Tomorrow they plan to make an example out of them. Silas felt something shift. Inside him, everything the sheriff had told him. Every report, every accusation. Suddenly, none of it sounded certain anymore. Below the ridge, Mercer stared into the fire and spoke quietly. Sometimes the law isn't justice, he said. Silas stood in the darkness above them, the wanted poster still folded inside his coat, and for the first time since taking the job, the bounty hunter who never missed began to wonder if he had been hunting the wrong man all along. Silas Crow remained on the ridge long after the fire. Below burned low. The wind moved slowly across the valley, carrying the smell of smoke and desert. Dust. Down below, Mercer and the others eventually settled into silence, their horses shifting quietly beside the rocks. Silas did not move. For 15 years, his world had been simple. A name on a poster. A trail across the frontier. A man brought back in chains. Right and wrong were not his concern. The law paid the bounty. That was enough. But now the ground beneath that certainty felt less solid. Farmers, land disputes, railroad companies, Pinkertons, escorting prisoners. Silas had seen enough of the frontier to know how easily truth could be twisted once money and land became involved. Rail companies were powerful. Sheriffs sometimes worked for whoever kept their towns alive. And bounty hunters rarely asked questions. Silas reached into his coat and unfolded the wanted poster again. Daniel? Mercer stared back at him in faded ink. Train robber, murderer, outlaw leader. A reward large enough to make most men stop thinking. Silas folded the paper slowly. He thought about that winter night. Years ago, the canyon. The gunshots, the stranger who had stayed awake beside. A dying man simply because he believed some lives were worth saving. That man had been Daniel Mercer. Below the ridge, Mercer suddenly stood and stepped away from the fire. Scanning the dark valley, Silas knew that instinct. Men who lived on the run developed a sense for being watched for a moment. The two men stood only 100 yards apart, separated by darkness. In memory, Silas could have ended the job right then. A clean shot from the ridge. One bullet. The most feared bounty hunter in the frontier had taken far harder shots before, but Silas lowered the rifle instead. He turned quietly and walked back to his horse. By morning, the Pinkerton convoy Mercer had mentioned would be moving toward the rail line with 6 prisoners locked inside iron cages. If Mercer was telling the truth, then those men would hang. Silas mounted his horse slowly. The desert sky beginning to pale with the first hint of dawn. For the first time in his career, the bounty hunter who never missed had made a different choice. He wasn't riding to capture Daniel Mercer anymore. He was riding to find out who the real criminals were. And in the West, that kind of decision often meant becoming an outlaw yourself. The Pinkerton convoy appeared just after noon. Silas Crow watched from a rocky ridge overlooking the narrow trail that wound through the desert valley. The heat shimmered above the sand, and the distant sound of wagon wheels echoed against the cliffs. 2 wagons, 6 mounted guards, and behind the first wagon, iron cages bolted to thick wooden frames. Inside them sat the prisoners. Silas studied the scene through narrowed eyes. None of the men looked like hardened criminals. Their clothes were simple work shirts and dust-covered boots. One of them was older, his gray beard hanging low as he stared silently at the ground. Farmers, just like Mercer had said. At the front of the convoy rode a man in a dark coat, sitting tall in the saddle with the kind of confidence that came from authority. Backed by money, not a sheriff, not a marshal. A Pinkerton agent. Silas had crossed paths with men like him, a private. Law hired by powerful companies who believed the frontier belonged to whoever could afford to control it. The convoy moved slowly toward the narrowest part of the valley, exactly where Daniel Mercer had said it would. Silas glanced toward the canyon walls. Nothing. No movement. For a moment, he wondered if Mercer had changed his mind. Then the first rifle shot exploded across the valley. A Pinkerton guard dropped from his horse before anyone understood what had happened. Gunfire erupted from both sides of the canyon as Mercer's men opened fire from hidden positions along the rocks. The convoy erupted into chaos. Horses panicked. Guards scrambled for cover behind the wagons. Dust and gunpowder filled the air as bullets cracked against stone. Silas remained on the ridge, watching. He could see Mercer now. The man moved through the chaos with calm precision, firing only when it's necessary, shouting orders to his men, "Don't shoot the prisoners." Another Pinkerton fell, but the convoy guards were trained. Within seconds, they regrouped, returning fire toward the canyon walls. One of Mercer's men was hit, collapsing behind a boulder. The gunfight intensified. Silas made his decision. He raised his rifle. From the ridge above, he fired once. A Pinkerton rifleman, aiming at Mercer, spun sideways and fell from his horse. The sudden shot from above stunned both sides. Silas fired again. Another guard dropped below. Mercer turned sharply toward the ridge, recognition flashing across his face, even from the distance. The tide of the fight shifted quickly after that. Within minutes, the remaining Pinkertons realized they were outmatched. Two of them fled down the trail, leaving the wagons and prisoners behind. The valley slowly fell silent, except for the echo of the last. Gunshots. Mercer approached the wagons cautiously and smashed the cage locks with the butt of his rifle. The prisoners stepped out slowly, blinking in the bright desert. Sun. Silas rode down from the ridge. The two men met in the middle of the dusty trail. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Mercer looked at him with a tired half-smile. "I wondered how long it would take you to find me." Silas studied him carefully. "I didn't come for the bounty," he said. Mercer nodded. "I know." The wind moved quietly through the valley as the freed prisoners gathered their things behind them. Two men who had once met by chance in a dark canyon now stood together again, both knowing that after today, neither of them would be able to ride freely through the frontier ever again. Because the moment Silas Crow fired those shots, the most reliable bounty hunter in the West had just turned his gun against the law. The desert was quiet again by evening. The wagons were gone. The prisoners had taken fresh horses and scattered across the frontier, each man riding toward whatever life still waited for him, beyond the reach of railroad companies and hired lawmen. Daniel Mercer stood beside the dying fire, watching the horizon fade into shades of orange and purple. Silas Crow prepared his saddle. Nearby, neither man had spoken much since the fight. They didn't need to. Both understood what had changed by sunrise. Word would spread quickly across the territory. Pinkerton agents killed, prisoners freed. A bounty hunter firing on company men. Stories traveled fast in the West, and the story would be simple. Silas Crow had become an outlaw. Mercer Crow finally broke the silence. "You could have taken the money," he said quietly. Silas tightened the strap on his saddle. "Maybe." Mercer looked toward the distant trail. "You know they'll come for you now." Silas gave a small nod. That part didn't bother him. For years he had chased men across the frontier, believing he was serving justice. But somewhere along the way, the lines between law and power had become harder to see. Today had simply forced him to choose which side of that line he stood on. Mercer stepped closer. "You don't have to ride with us," he said. "There's still time to disappear." Silas mounted his horse and looked out across the endless desert, the same desert where he had once been left bleeding in the dirt, and where Mercer had chosen to save a stranger. "Some debts don't disappear," Silas said. Mercer studied him for a moment. Then he nodded. Two riders mounted their horses. Beneath the darkening sky, by morning, they would be gone, just to shadows, riding deeper into the frontier. But this time, the West would be hunting them, in the Wild West. Men were often judged by the laws they followed, but sometimes the real measure of a man was the moment he chose to break them. Silas Crow had spent 15 years bringing outlaws to justice. In a single day, he discovered that justice doesn't always wear a badge. If you enjoy dark, cinematic stories from the frontier, subscribe to Whispers of the West for more untold legends of the Wild West.